Hey, Matt. Yeah, thanks for joining me today. It's good to connect with you on yet another podcast. I feel like we're always talking to each other on air.
It's always a pleasure to be on your podcast. If I were ever to have to call in a podcast favor, I would have to say, hey, Brian, bring me on to one of your shows at some point. But it's a pleasure to be here.
Anytime, man. Anytime. I mean, that's part of the reason I started this show is just to talk to people I like, and we can talk about whatever. And especially bringing someone on who is real comfortable on the mics. You've been doing it for years, so I think we'll be talking all about that. I mean, one thing that I've been noticing, you've had so many different shows over the years. You've had the Matt Report, which I'm guessing is like the longest running show that you've been doing, right?
Correct.
But you've been involved in so many different things between like Castos and I've been seeing your thing with the WP Minute. I think you were doing something local to your area as well, right?
Yeah, South Coast.fm. That's a labor of love. That I do probably once every other month just to keep a pulse on the area, and kind of highlight people who are building businesses here. And then hosting the audience podcast in my professional life, hosting the audience podcast for Castos. Mm-hmm. And I'm also an executive producer for our other podcast that we acquired, 3clipspodcast.com.
Right.
And that's been an interesting role for me to experience and learn on the job with.
Yeah. I'd like to, where should we even begin? Like what I'd like to really unpack in this part of our conversation is, I guess it's in the WP Minute, but maybe you do this sort of thing in your other podcasts too, like where you're really focusing on news as a content type. Because in our industry, we see a lot of interview based shows, and then we see a lot of just co-host shows like I do with Jordan. But most of that stuff is like more or less evergreen. I guess you could say some of these bootstrapper shows are like what we're working on now this week. But it sounds like you're going after like a true news show for the industry, for at least the WordPress industry. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, the WPMinute.com. If I zoom out and I put my how to be a podcaster hat on, what we like to see is we have a premise for a show, whatever that premise might be. And like everything else in life, your podcast muscle gets a little bit stronger the more you do it. Not everybody has to be perfect out of the gate. God knows I wasn't and still am not. So I like to preface all of my podcast advice with that. As long as you're on this pursuit of enjoying, number one, but and number two, you're on this pursuit to improve things. That's all you need to worry about. You don't have to be perfect. So you have this premise of your show. The premise of the WP Minute is that I'm delivering the most impactful WordPress news to busy WordPress professionals. Even that's kind of a weak premise, but that's the premise that I'm leading with. And then there's the format. So we have our premise, and then we have the format. And the format of the WP Minute is, as in the name, it's a 5-minute podcast for, again, the busy professional. So if you don't have time, nor do you want to listen to long, drawn-out WordPress podcasts, like my other podcast, the Matt Report, then this sort of solves for that customer, right? Let's say it solves for that audience.
Yeah.
Quick,
5 minutes
5
is
minutes.
super short. So are you doing like daily episodes or what does that look like?
No. So, if acquisitions were as hot as they were towards the tail end of 2021 in WordPress, you could potentially get by with a daily podcast. WordPress news doesn't, fire off like that. So it's every Wednesday. Mm-hmm. And so it's 5 minutes every Wednesday. It does a few things. For me, it allows me to be a little bit more creative because it's easy to record an interview show for an hour and upload it. It's much harder to make edit decisions and edit the show down to something valuable in a condensed format.
That was going to be my next question is like, how is it even possible to get only 5 minutes? Like, I think people don't quite realize like it's a lot harder to go shorter with podcasts than it's a lot easier and sort of like lazier to go longer with podcasts.
Yeah. Right? There's a lot of content in the WordPress space. There's a lot of, WordPress podcasts, which is quite funny. There are a lot of WordPress podcasts. There's a lot of choices out there. We're all kind of talking the same thing, but maybe at a different angle. A lot of us just talking about everything. And the WP Minute really makes me focus in on just the most impactful headlines. So it won't be like, hey, WordPress has launched a new version would be news, but like this, not this little point release feature, or we're not talking about security bugs, or hey, maybe Elementor came out with a new feature. Like, we're not going to be covering that stuff. We're only going to be covering the most impactful news items that we feel are the most impactful news items. And the WP Minute is also an experiment to a first for me, which I've been trying for many years, is community journalism.
Yeah,
and
I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah. So what I've done is sort of open up the floodgates, but I open up the opportunity for folks to contribute a 1-minute clip to that weekly episode. Yeah, so sometimes, it might be a 7-minute podcast if I have 2 people contributing 2 clips, but these are 2 really unique segments from people from within the community. So yeah, it could vary anywhere between 3 to 7 minutes of a podcast, depending on what the news is. And that has allowed me to be a little bit more creative.
So the people contributing, would that be like news creators themselves? So like, I'm from a company, we have something to announce, or is it like, hey, I noticed that thing over there, this should be covered, let me talk about it? Yeah.
So the other part of my brain as a podcaster and as sort of a business person is monetization of a podcast like this. And there's a few ways that I've monetized this podcast. It's your standard sponsorship, that I sell standard sponsorship spots. And then I have a membership that you can buy for $79 for the year. It gets you access to this Discord server. You become a producer, and producers have the opportunity to contribute this 1-minute clip or a news item that I talk about on the show within the Discord server. So it kind of gets them invested in the news. And oh, by the way, if they're a freelancer or an agency or a product owner, it's a great way to get some eyeballs on their brand and get them, some brand awareness as well.
That's super interesting.
And then I have some contributors that I do invite, into the group. Hey, you've come to me and you've expressed, hey, Matt, like we have Michelle Schulp, and she contributes a monthly 1-minute clip on health and wellness. And she's a WordPress freelancer, has her own and she has her own thing. So this is a cool, like really unique segment. It's fun. It's right, this 1-minute, boost of health and wellness, and that's really cool. And she contributes that, and she gets, some eyeballs on her Twitter avatar every time it's announced. And it's just it's been a fun experiment from that point of view. So some folks are paid members and they get access, and then others are, contributors that have some skin in the game with contributing content.
Super cool. So who is that podcast for? Is it, so you said it's for WordPress professionals, so people who are consultants, freelancers, agencies, plugin shops. They need to know like what's happening in the WordPress space. Maybe need to know what's happening before everyone else knows it. This thing sort of gives them like cutting edge information really quick.
Yeah, the biggest challenge with WordPress news, you can almost equate it to your local news, where the local news is much more important than your national and your global news.
Yeah.
It's actually much more important to see like what the heck is happening.
It's where you live.
Yeah, it's where you live. It's where you can make the most impact, and it's it's what you should be hearing about. The problem is a lot of people just don't care about it. So your average WordPress user, she's running a bakery and or a law firm, and she's got a WordPress site, and she doesn't know like what's the big things happening with this piece of software that's oh so crucial to my business or to my brand. I would love, and that's kind of where I'm trending to, where I want to trend to, is how do I reach the common WordPress user that's actually going to care about this stuff, which is why I've really condensed it down to the 5 minutes, because ain't no way anyone who doesn't care about this stuff will ever, listen to, a 45-minute podcast talking about the latest CSS release from, again, from Elementor or Gutenberg or something like that. So right now it's the professionals, it's the folks that are in the crowd, people who are listening to the Matt Report and other notable WordPress podcasts.
And how much?
I'd love to hit the bigger audience.
So how much of a balance is it between drawing on stories and contributions from the members versus just you finding a story and talking about it for a few minutes?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I've kind of built this in a way that this is like a side project for me. Again, another reason why I've condensed the format down to something really short. This actually started a gentleman in the WordPress space. He puts out a newsletter called the WP Weekly, Devinder Singh Kainth. And at one point in my career, I was like, hey, man, how about I turn your newsletter into a podcast and I just read your newsletter? And like, let me just experiment with that. And he was like, hey, that's fine, but I think you should do your own thing because I think you'll do it even better. And I was like, look, man, I don't want another project. So, yeah. He convinced me. He's like, look, this is how you should do it. It's really quick. You can use my newsletter, but still brand it fully yours. I'm like, okay, I'll try it. And that's sort of snowballed into this. But to answer your question, I have my executive producer, and she writes the script for me every week. And we do subscribe to all of the newsletters. But I have this little thing called the Link Squad. So if you're in my Discord group, you can go into one of the channels. It's just a channel that we just put links in, and you say, hey, I saw this on WP Tavern. This is a great new feature for Gutenberg, #Link Squad. And then I capture all of those links in a Notion database. And then my executive producer and I, every Tuesday into Wednesday, will just scan through all of the links that people have submitted and either select or remove the ones that we think are just not newsworthy for this week. So it sort of has like this little, I don't want to say it runs on autopilot because it certainly doesn't, but we have this nice little contribution wheel of people who bring us links, and then submit their content. And then we just pull the big stories that we see throughout the week.
That's super cool to hear you describe that, because this is really something that's been on my mind for well over a year, is the idea, even with this podcast, it's turning into just a conversations show, but I've had this idea for a long time, or a mix of ideas for a show. One is sort of just a news show like that, but for like bootstrapped software, not WordPress, but just, because I still don't think that there's good coverage of what's actually happening right now. Like there's a few bootstrapper podcasts, right, who talk about what they do week to week. That's what a small handful. There's hundreds or thousands of these really interesting startups, shipping interesting work or hiring interesting people, trying to do interesting things, or acquisitions or sales and things like that. And everyone's so busy working on their stuff, they're not actually sharing what they're working on. And so like I've wanted forever, like the idea of doing like a news show. The holdback, the reason why I haven't done it is because I every time I think about it, I just think about how much work it would be to gather all of those stories, without it just being stories about my small group of friends and what they're working on.
Yeah, and that's the formula that you really have to hit. And is quite challenging still, even with, in the WordPress space. Anything community driven is just that. It's community driven. You think about anything that you do for either your community or that you sort of donate your time to, and the ebbs and flows of sometimes you're like, I just don't have time to, like contribute to this area anymore, where you kind of fall off. And I certainly saw that, like ramping the project up from, the community side of it. Didn't start until September of last year, 2021. And then all the way up until the holiday, it was just, everything was up and to the right. Like people were excited. People were buying the memberships on Buy Me a Coffee, and everything was moving. And then holidays hit, and then forget about it. There's no news, like big news happening either. But there's people that are just like drop off from contribution because you have the holidays. And then I suspect, and January was a pretty dry month, but February is starting to kick back up again with more community contributions. I suspect because January, it's just like, I've set all my New Year's resolutions, and that is to focus on me and my business. So I'm not going to contribute in this little community thing. So I've definitely noticed some particular challenges in that area.
But I just like
You know,
the
and then
combination of like you've got this like feed of links and
Right.
the Discord community where it's like you can always go to that feed for sort of like raw material, right? But then but you
Correct.
do have that like editorial control over like, all right, what's actually interesting, newsworthy, and what's just sort of promotional and not that interesting, right?
Yeah. You know, another interesting experiment that I've done with this, because at some point, you know, all I'm doing is reporting on the news. You know, I'm not. There's no well, there is original stories that are happening. So if you go to the WPminute.com, actually a brand new website that launched today, that I haven't even announced it yet. Just did a soft launch last night.
You heard it here first, folks.
Brand new, you know, redesign. There's an original section, what I call original, so original content from the WP Minute. And that's been an interesting thing, is getting folks who want to be WordPress journalists or a journalist covering a particular topic, because WordPress is pretty big when it comes to, I don't know, freedom of speech, Google, search engine optimization. There's a lot of stuff that WordPress touches that's kind of interesting in the tech space. And then getting people to contribute there has been an interesting ride. I've done this thing called what I call a content bounty. And a content bounty, I don't know if this exists. It could exist in another world. I just came up with it. But what I do is I say, hey, if you want to write a piece or a series of blogs or podcasts, come to me with whatever number that is in your head. Like, what does it cost? What would you want to be paid to contribute a blog post? And I've done this successfully now 3 times. Most people come to me, they're like, yeah, you know, for a couple $100, I'll write a blog post about XYZ topic. So I say, okay, great. A couple $100, you write this piece. And then what I do is I turn to, you know, my audience and I say, I've got this person who wants to write this story. Will you sponsor this story for $300? And then I just put it out into Twitter. I have a WooCommerce product. Somebody comes and they buy it and they sponsor the writer to write it.
Oh,
the writer
and they get their sponsorship on it.
They get their sponsorship on it. The writer gets $200. The WP Minute keeps $100 to invest back into the business as the profit. And I've executed on that successfully 3 times. It's
wow, that's super smart. I like that.
Pretty big snowball to push up a hill.
Yeah, it's like
know,
a two-sided marketplace kind of thing. But I could totally see the incentive for both the writer and like a company to sponsor it. You know.
Yeah, because what does everybody say about the news? And I'll talk about it specifically in the WordPress space. Is who funds the news, right? So you have like the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, right? And then, you know, to equate that to maybe the WordPress world, the newspaper of record for WordPress, if you could say that, is WP Tavern, which is owned by Audrey Capital, who is Matt Mullenweg's investment company. So the notable, you know, same thing. It's like Washington Post and Jeff Bezos. And then if I were to have the WP Minute fully funded by, let's say, GoDaddy, then one would say, oh, well, you're only going to say good things about GoDaddy. You're never going to say good, you know, bad things about GoDaddy.
Yeah.
So if I could fund this,
an independent press here in the WordPress space. I like it.
Right. So if I could fund it like this, which is extremely challenging and silly, but it's an experiment that I am trying.
Well, it sounds like you've got a good mix of like, you got these like sponsorship bounty posts. You've got the memberships through the Discord. When you started describing it at first, where I thought you were going with it was sort of like a crowdfunded model, right? Like if somebody has a pitch for an article or a series of articles, do you ever get like multiple bidders on, or have like 5 or 10 or 20 people listed as sponsors on it? Or?
Yeah, you know, I haven't approached it at that angle yet, only because technology and time. So I just figure like the easiest thing is just WooCommerce link, sell it. That's how I sell all my other sponsorships. I have some other ideas for a crowdsource initiative. There's 2 other ideas that I have coming for like funding and raising some money for it. But no, I have not done it for multiple sponsors per post. But there's nothing really stopping me from doing that.
Super cool. Yeah, like I said, like, you know, the idea of like a news show for just software companies has been on my mind for a while. The other thing that I thought I was going to execute on last year and never quite did it, again, same kind of challenges. Like I thought I was going to call this show Shipped, and it would be all about things that people are shipping. And like the idea would be to just like go knock on every company's door and be like, what are you working on right now? What story can we tell on the podcast about that? And just like, you know, because you see this like working in public trend now, or build in public, you know, thing on Twitter and everything. It's like there are so many people and companies who don't do that. Like they're working on really amazing things, but they're not sharing publicly what they're doing. And at least not like the behind the scenes story of how it came together. And I just think that there are so many useful, interesting stories to people like us who are building things. We get inspiration from what people are building. But it's like, how do you piece together the operation to, well, actually do it, actually find those stories, and then like you're talking about, like funding it and making it like a sustainable thing, you know? Super hard.
Yeah. I mean, if I were to look at I was just looking at the numbers the other day, and if I count, so my sponsorship is kind of mixed because it also sponsors sort of the Matt Report too, but I kind of broke it out, you know, as a brand new podcast. I launched the podcast portion of it in April 2021. And then didn't open up the membership and the content bounty stuff until September. Roughly, the podcast has made about $10,000 in revenue, which does not fund a full-time writer. I mean, it doesn't fund a business, let alone a full-time, you know, writer.
But on the unit level, right? Like on a single article that gets funded by the bounty, like it's not like that's money out of your pocket, right?
Right, that's correct. So it is a way to sort of offset that. And then the answer is just to scale it. And then if you were a true business person, you would say, yeah, just don't do it in the WordPress space because that's the challenge, right? Is that the audience isn't there. And maybe this springboards into something that is more of like true independent news in a particular region or a particular city. And the model can be applied there, but because the news is much more sought after, then the opportunity to sort of grow, you know, the clicks and the views and the value is a little bit easier.
Yeah, it is interesting. Like, I mean, WordPress still seems so massive in terms of a market and the number of people and of course number of websites. But I guess there is the question of like how much of that ocean of WordPress is actually interested in tuning into like the real insider track of what's happening in WordPress. I would think it's still a huge audience, right?
Yeah. Well, I would say like I have a particular number in mind that in the entire world, the amount of people who actually care about the inside baseball of WordPress is probably around 5,000 people who actually care about what's happening with WordPress. Now,
it seems low.
How many people use WordPress who would be like remotely curious of like where the software is going? Now we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who actually like use it and care. Like, well, maybe there's like something happening with WordPress that I might tune into. But I would say that the overall reach of people who care about like the inside baseball is very, very small, but also very, very valuable at the same time, because these are decision makers, whatever, influencers, etc.
You know, I think it might be on both ends though, like a higher end and like a more entry level end, right? Because it's like, I could totally see how the higher end, like, so people who are in large companies, they're sort of more concerned with like recruiting and maybe acquisitions and competition and that sort of like insider knowledge. But if I remember back, like the period of time when I was most engaged and hungry for information about WordPress in my case, but also like startups in general, was when I was brand new to the industry. You know, so thinking back to like probably around the time when you and I met, which must have been around like 2010, 2009, 2010. You know, I was relatively new to WordPress. WordPress had been around for a few years before that. So I felt like I was playing catch up in terms of like, who are the big players? What's happening? What is what here? And that's when I was hungry for that sort of information, you know.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. I
interesting.
mean, I think as the year marches on, I know, one of the properties that I've sort of, given up on just because I have zero time left is I have a plugin WordPress plugin tutorial channel on YouTube, which still continues to grow organically. I haven't uploaded a video since I started my full-time job at Castos because I just have zero time to even look at that. But just like your local newspaper, who might launch a Fashion Week spread, and you're like, a Fashion Week spread? Why would you do that in this local newspaper?
Right.
Is because it does bring in those extra eyeballs to hopefully stick around to read the news, right? So it's just this common media trend is you start covering more things. And I know that with the WP Minute, I could start doing the tutorial stuff, and that is ultimately the gateway to your average you're more than average user, but the biggest audience of WordPress content consumers are going to be the people who are teach me how to do this thing with this popular WordPress plugin.
Because they're like Googling right
like,
now, like how to do this thing, right?
Yeah, like that is by far absolutely the best thing to do to grow a WordPress content site, which I know.
Interesting.
I'm just not doing it.
I wonder about like opinion versus just hard news. You know, like how much of that? I know I feel like WordPress is like notorious for like opinions and battles of ideology and all this different stuff, right? But like even when I think about how I consume like world news and national news and stuff, like I'll listen to I read the New York Times, but I go straight for the opinion pages most of the time because that is like the most interesting part of the news for me, is to hear different people's actual views on what's happening. I'm wondering if that's like an element here where it's like we'll give you the news, but like here's what one person thinks about it. Here's what somebody else thinks about it. Like,
so I do have 2 contributors that are more consistent in that space. I call them our correspondents, right? So I have who Dave Rodenbaugh.
Oh.
He talks mainly about e-commerce, and I give him about whatever he up to a 10-minute podcast, right? So I'm just trying to keep it within the creative sphere of the WP Minute. So I say, hey Dave, you can go up to 10 minutes in this audio monologue, talk to us about e-commerce, talked about how WordPress impacts e-commerce, etc. Then I have Spencer Foreman, who also runs sort of an e-commerce place, WP Launchify, and he's our correspondent on the future of WordPress. So he brings in a lot of his opinions on how maybe like Gutenberg and full site editing are starting to shape WordPress. And I had a gentleman that used to be our community lead, Paul Lacey. He wrote like a 3,000 word piece. It was sort of his exit piece to his retirement piece to WordPress on how Gutenberg changed the community and how he really didn't want to be a part of it anymore because he didn't feel like he was a part of it anymore. And that one got probably about 3,000 views, that blog post. And that was one that was really impactful. Got shared a lot and stuff like that. So the opinion pieces, 100%, they definitely bring the eyeballs.
Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, you're obviously doing a lot of shows. What I love about what you're doing is like, you are experimenting with different formats, content types. You're not just going to the same tried and true formula that like 1,000 other podcasts are doing. So that's, huge kudos to you. I mean, obviously you've been doing podcast content and video content for a long time. So this is not new to you. I'm curious, like out of all the different shows that you're doing between the WP Minute and Matt Report, and even like going back through all the stuff that you've ever done, like what is the most, I guess it's like this stuff that you're doing now, right? Like the most interesting, or where you see the podcast or content industry sort of trending going forward. Any kind of like vision going forward here?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think everybody's going to, if you're just a general podcaster and you're like, how do I grow my brand and awareness? Podcasting is awesome. And I know I'm super biased because I've been doing it for a decade and I work for Castos. So I teach people about this stuff all the time. But it is, once you've invested in it and once you've given it enough time and enough thought and care and attention, it does become something that's very powerful and very hard for your competition to compete against, if that's the way you're looking at it. People have to get better over time. like the whole, just record and upload, that's going to have to, go away unless you're in a non-competitive space. But this is just an attention economy. You need to do something different and better. It doesn't have to be like you have to worry about it. You just have to be on this pursuit to constantly get better.
Yeah.
Because if you just sit there and worry, you'll just never launch. And I've done that a million times. You just never want. You tinker with it, you adjust things, and then it never works. You spend a million hours try to buy the best microphone. It doesn't matter. It's about the content.
Yeah,
it's about the content, and it's about how you promote it. As those are the two most important things.
Like yes, you need good audio quality, and that's easier than ever to get these days with today's microphones and everything. But yeah, it's totally about the content. And you're totally right. Like, it's not going to happen out of the gate, and I'm still kind of fumbling around on the mic even after podcasting for several years. But like, it's having this sense for like, what are we talking about that the listener, like, what does the listener probably want to hear next? What do they wonder? What are the questions that they're asking? I mean, I remember listening to Andrew Warner on Mixergy for many years, but especially several years ago, just being amazed at how he has this knack for, like, literally the next question he's asking is the question that I had in my head.
Yeah.
It's just incredible.
Time. Yeah. Just to plug a little bit of what I do at Castos, the best thing that, how do I get better at podcasting? Check out the podcast, 3clipspodcast.com. That's a show that we acquired from the original creator, Jay Acunzo. And he was the host for a little while, and then sort of moved on at the end of 2021, and we brought on a new host, Evo Terra, and he's running that now with our producer, Stuart Barefoot. And I'll tell you, you want to talk about imposter syndrome and, that constant mental tug of war, like, I'm not the person that should be in this room. That's me, as the executive producer of that show. And I hear Evo read this out, every episode. Matt Medeiros is the executive producer of 3 Clips Podcast. I'm like, what a big phone. You're a phony. You're a phony. That's all I hear right in the background. Because Evo is just, he was the 40th podcast ever on Apple iTunes. So he's been doing it forever.
Wow.
And Stuart's just an amazing producer, and they're interviewing people from Vox, from all of these just high-end, podcast production places. But anyway, the point is 3 Clips Podcast, they interview hosts of great podcasts, and they dissect 3 clips from that show. So if you ever thought about, like, what goes into sound design and storytelling, it's just an amazing show to learn that stuff, so you can get a feel for what really happens on high-end shows.
Very cool. Well, we're going to get all this stuff linked up in the show notes. Matt, it was awesome to talk to you on this segment, all about, how you're kind of like experimenting with all these different formats. And I mean, really, you've seen it all at this point. So, really cool to get your insight. I'm excited to see how WP Minute evolves and all of your other stuff. But, I think in the next segment, it might be really cool to sort of unpack what you just talked about, like the executive producer role. What does that look like? And what does it look like to kind of produce this stuff and be more efficient and focusing on quality? So maybe we'll get into that in the next one. So yeah,
sounds
thanks, man.
good. Thank you.
All right. So I'm just going to mark that there, and we can sort of, roll right into this next segment if that works for you.
Yes, sir.
Cool. I've got my coffee and my water, like, right next to me. It's probably, this is like not the professional way to podcast, but all right. So Matt Medeiros, we're back for another segment here. We're gonna continue talking about podcasting and just I guess you'd call it like media content production in general. I think that you've got this spectrum of content that, like, especially what we see in our industry, whether it's WordPress or software startups, we're all sort of tuned into podcasts, and that makes a lot of us amateur podcasters as well, right? Like, unlike other industries, I don't think other industries are podcasting nonstop about what they're working on, but us web people, no. Like, we can't help it but speak into the internet, right? So we've got a lot of these amateurs like myself who just, will buy a fancy microphone and hit record and maybe hack our way through editing or maybe hire an editor. But like, how can we like up our game in terms of production and also like streamlining? That's what I want to try to understand in this conversation here, because like what I'm trying to do right now with this new show is I want to keep the level of quality high. I want to have really good conversations, but I cannot spend all my time doing this. I just want to hop on a call like this 3 times a month and hand off the rest to my editor, producer, and just have it published. Like that's sort of the goal. And I feel like I'm figuring that out again for like the 10th time around. I never quite cracked it. So, So, I mean, I guess let's start there. Like, what are some, you've been doing this for many years. Like, what are some like low hanging fruit, like processes or workflows that have just saved you a ton of time and like really started to click in terms of your workflow?
Sure. So to correct your label, you call yourself an amateur, but you've been doing it probably just as long as I have, because the first podcast I was ever on was your podcast with Dave from way back in the day.
Oh, wow.
And that's where Bootstrap Web started off, right? That was the name of it, if I recall correctly.
No,
right?
the one that was with Dave Yankovic. This was back in like 2010. It must have been around then. Freelance Jam? Was that what that was called?
Oh, it might have been. That might have been
so that was a set that wasn't Bootstrap Web. Bootstrap Web started a couple years later, but yeah. That was a lot of fun.
So you're much more advanced than, although you might feel like an amateur, I see people who are just starting out. They are amateurs. Nothing wrong with that. So, number one, it's just like, where the heck are you going to go with this podcast? A lot of people just, it's so cliche to talk about goal setting and like striving for that goal and having stuff written down. But let me tell you, once you get through the first 10 episodes of your podcast, that's where you begin to hate it. So if you don't have a North Star anymore, that's when it becomes really difficult. And that's when you start flip-flopping all over the place. And what I learned early on is try to marry that goal, especially if you're a busy person, try to marry that goal with a season or a story arc and something that you can just put a little end chapter in.
Yeah, take a breather.
Because take a breather, 100%. That's what I do. That's what we do with our 3 Eclipse podcast. It's 8 episodes, take a month break, another season starts, different story arc, etc. That just gives you so much time to just take a break and just reassess if things are working. And if they're not working, you get to recharge and maybe take it down a different path. Setting that really critically thinking about like the premise of your show, like, wow, who am I? Why am I doing this? And who am I addressing with this content? And if you're really into editing or not, it doesn't really matter, but really think critically about 1, maybe 2 topics, because if it's just an open-ended conversation, that's where the wheels eventually start to fall off. It might not happen in every episode, but you'll eventually get a guess where it falls off. And let me zoom out and frame how I approach that. So another key thing to my workflow is the pre-interview. So especially if I don't know the person who I'm talking to, 99.9% of the time, the person who's on my shows, I'm reaching out to. Very rarely do I ever allow anyone who pitches me, because the pitches are all terrible.
Yeah, totally.
So I'll hit somebody with, hey, I'd love to chat with you about this topic I saw you talking about on Twitter. Is that interesting to you? They say yes, or they'd like to learn more. No problem. Here's my Savvy Cal. It's just a 15-minute chat, and I'm just going to give you like a brief technical overview. This is what it's like to be on a podcast. This is what I need from you. And then give me 1 or 2 things that you're amazing at talking about.
So you have the call as, this is not recorded. This is pre-interview.
This is not recorded. Yeah. I just want to talk to you and I want to hear from you only the 1 or 2, mainly 1 thing that you're really great at talking about. Like if you had a room full of people, what's the 1 thing? Because that's ultimately going to be the best thing you're going to get out of somebody.
Yeah.
Right. If you start talking to somebody who's like a developer, which I fall into that too, interviewing people about WordPress, they're developers. They don't tell me about your marketing. Well, they're terrible at marketing. So then like the conversation is just terrible about marketing. So I try to get that one thing that somebody's awesome.
That's a really good point.
About.
As you saw with this show, I'm using my tool ZipMessage to do that pre-interview, basically asynchronously, because again, I'm trying to, I completely agree. The value of a pre-interview, some sort of plan, like a game plan in terms of what the topics are going to be, is so valuable. Because I've been a guest on so many podcasts where I show up for the podcast and they don't even know like what I do. Like they're just asking me a list of 10 questions that they ask the same questions to every guest. So I really love the value of the pre-interview, but again, I can't spend like an extra hour or a half hour in addition to the actual recording because I have a business to run. So I'm using ZipMessage to sort of like async that into a more efficient workflow. But I like what you're saying. I think where I'm falling short on that is I do go to guests currently with like 2 topic ideas that I think are really interesting, but I should open it up more to say like, what's something that you really want to talk about, especially something that you haven't talked about elsewhere. Because there's probably stuff I wouldn't even know, that they could talk about.
Yeah. Because, like me, if you just love being on podcasts and you had came to me and you're like, hey man, you want to do a podcast about your favorite apple pie recipe? I'd be like, sure. Just get me on your show. I'll talk about it. I don't know anything about like baking or making a great apple pie. I'm still going to do it though, so I could have some airtime. So I do want to hit, that 1 or 2 thing that they're great at. And then ask them, a few things about what's going to make it work for them, make them feel comfortable. What are you going to get out of this? What do you want to get out of this? Is there something you really want to promote? Because that's just a great way to just build rapport and find things that work. And then, you hit them. It's also an important time to be like, yep, the best way to, you hear them, you interview them really quick, and then you get a chance to say, hey, and don't forget when I do send this live, it's usually 2 weeks after we record, don't forget to share it. You get a little bit of that love back, because sharing the episode from your guest, although it sounds super obvious, as somebody who's been doing it for 10 years and you see people who don't share it, you're just like, oh God, I just spent all that time and you don't even share it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's like they're getting even more invested in the process. They're doing the pre-interview.
You're getting more invested in the process. Yeah. And there's ways that you can automate all that stuff to happen afterwards. So that's just like a huge opportunity. Yeah.
I mean, like on that point about sharing it, like I've been a guest on many shows, and I do try to at least tweet when I've been a guest on somewhere, but like the ones where I really look forward to sharing it are when I came on to talk about something that I never get a chance to talk about elsewhere. We covered something that I've never talked publicly about, because that person cared enough to ask me about that stuff or find some thread that I have that might be interesting. And so that's what's more exciting for a guest to go out and tell their audience about, I think. Yeah.
So that's how I make sure that an interview doesn't go off the rails. That's how I kind of streamline that, is you just front load invest, that 15 minutes of time. But the other way I streamline the mental weight of a podcast is SavvyCal allows you to have limits based on bookings per link. So what I do is I set 3 maximum pre-interviews per week and 1 maximum interview per week for a given podcast. 1, because I don't have time to do all of these podcasts, but 2, like, how it is. If you start recording a whole bunch of, some people are really good at this. I'm not. So this might be you, dear listener, or you might be really good at this, but I'm not good at taking a day and recording 8 episodes.
No way.
Because I just fall flat.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, this is my one interview today. Like the rest of my day is shot at this point.
Right. Yeah. And I set that up in SavvyCal, to just like streamline, that work. And, again, to your point, ZipMessage, I use that all the time for, feedback. And I actually have, it's crazy to say, like I have another show idea, which I'm not willing to talk about, like the format of it, but ZipMessage is going to be a huge component of it, because look, you could just say, yeah, I don't have the time. Like my brother, he can't, he's going to kill me if he hears this, but he does a podcast about finance and investment and stuff like that. And he started a podcast and he's like, I hate this. It's just so much work.
Yeah.
It's so much energy. And then the people show up and they're not good at interviews. He's like, how have you been doing this for 10 years? And you could use a tool like Zip Message and just get a bunch of answers recorded. And then you just edit it together with you just saying the question. So if you don't even want to talk to people, you could do that.
So, I have been totally experimenting with that, with using Zip Message for podcasting. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. The way that I actually started doing this last year, I had about 4 or 5 guests where we were recording the entire interview asynchronously using Zip Message. I did one with like Chris Lemma, one with Derek from SavvyCal, one with 80 PNR. And it was kind of cool because I could send them a Zip message. They send something back. They share their screen. They showed me a tour of their workspace. You get all this cool footage. But the challenge that I had with that format asynchronously for a podcast is that, again, it comes back to the time investment, because it's not just like 1 hour, we get it all recorded. It ended up being an entire week project of every single day, me or 80 are going back and forth like once or twice with a message to get the whole thing finished before Friday,
Yeah.
So that was sort of challenging, and it didn't really go much, past like the 4 conversations that I had that way for the podcast. But now with this show, I'm using Zip Message, one for that pre-interview, like we talked about, to sort of plan. But then the other thing is, I have the same 3 questions that I'm asking everyone, like rapid fire questions. Give me one favorite podcast, one favorite book, and one favorite music artist or album. And I'm having them respond to those asynchronously through Zip Message. And then I'm going to compile those into like one episode of like 5 favorite books from 5 different people, Yeah. And I actually like that a little bit better because, first of all, our conversation here is better to have live because we're just talking through this thing. But those rapid fire questions, like I've been asked sort of rapid fires as a guest on other shows, and I'm never ready for them. Like I never have a rapid fire answer that's ready to go. So it's always a terrible answer. And I think it's kind of cool if someone can like sort of just the whole value of async in general. It gives you space to think about it and prepare, and then and it's just a single question and answer, so we can edit it into the show.
Yeah, I think if you are like where I think Zip Message or asynchronous recording really shines would be if you're doing a narrated podcast.
Yeah.
If you think about, I don't know, you think, again, we go back to what we talked about in segment 1, we talked about like local news. If you'd imagine, I don't know, some big event happens at the power plant and the reporter goes down there and she interviews a bunch of people did you see the explosion? And they all start giving her feedback. She's got her field recorder. She's recording everybody. And then she goes back to the office and then she, edits that and pares it all down to a 2-minute, radio segment. That's where something like a Zip Message affords you that flexibility to, hey, I'm gonna send this out to a dozen people. You get all that B-roll or field footage or field recording. My producer will probably kill me of what the proper term is. And then you just have that in front of you and you get to pick the best moments of it and then pare it all down. Yeah, you're definitely going to take a lot more time, but it'd be not as much time having 12 individual phone calls.
For sure.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
So your editing time will still be probably lengthy, but your time spent interviewing folks way faster, way easier.
Yeah, I love it. So in the previous segment, you talked a little bit about being an executive producer yourself on the 3 Clips show, and you've been producing these shows for Castos and of course your own shows. Everyone hears the term executive producer. They hear it on television and on radio and on podcasts. Like, what does that actually mean? What does it look like? What is the value that an executive producer brings to a show?
Yeah. For in my case, I don't know what value I bring, but I'm the money guy. So I make sure that the money that Craig's invested in original series is is on track, on budget, and making sure that, we're just not spinning our wheels, wasting, too much time. Luckily everyone that works for the Three Clips podcast team, they're veteran podcasters. They know that they shouldn't be wasting time. But there have been a few moments where we've had other producers working on the show, for example, who are like, hey, I'm going to make some original music for this transition for this one episode. And I'd be like, no.
Yeah.
Like you're not going to do that, because we're not wasting time or money for something like this. We're not going to win awards for this show, although I'd love to. So there's things like that. I kind of watch the money side of things, and then making sure that it's content that we're creating that I think resonates with Castos as a brand. Making sure that that's on point, and making sure that everyone's happy. The process is working well, but otherwise I'm not stepping in saying, oh, you should talk to, this person, or you should talk to that person. I saw this great podcast over here. You should really go pull 3 clips from that. Like, I don't get involved in that.
Okay. So I was thinking of it more like that. Like, so I guess in the way you're describing it, it's really more of like a project manager kind of role, like making sure it's all coming together.
Yeah. And even that, like the producer really is almost like the lead project manager to a degree. I just got to make sure that we're not going off the rails at like a real high level.
I guess that's the difference between like an executive producer and like a single show's producer, where that person, or like the director, if you will, would be like piecing together a story, finding the right angle, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So like, I was in charge of finding the next host after Jay left. And, then that we have this idea that we might switch hosts, but then we also might have Evo stay on as like the storyteller. So you think of like the narrator almost of the entire podcast. So if we do move in that direction, it's interviewing a new host and seeing how that person reacts, and a little bit of marketing too. It's seeing what happened with that show or who they interviewed and being like, wow, this is a great guest. This is something that we can actually use for marketing for Castos proper, right? This is, so a producer from Vox Media or some other big outlet. Like, this is something we should use in our sales material. So it's kind of like connecting the dots across the brand.
Very cool. How about other things that like sort of like the glue that puts it all together, right? So if you think about, I mean, in your experience, you're talking about like a company funded, real professional like production studio. But I guess I'm thinking about more like folks like me and others who are kind of, they want to start a podcast maybe on the side of their main business, but they want it to be good. They want to keep that quality level high. They want to keep it efficient. I would almost never recommend people edit their own podcast unless they really, really want to, but that is just such a time suck. So, I do always try to hand it off to like an audio editor to get that handled. You could do the same thing with like the publishing of the show notes and publishing the episode and all that kind of stuff. But like, how does it all like piece together for you? Maybe like in your personal shows too, like Matt Report and all that other stuff. Like, how do you go from recording the show to handing off the files and making sure that it's still, you keep that quality level high and everything?
Yeah. So, I still edit Matt Report and the WP Minute myself. And there's just a few ways that I do go about it. So yes, it's time consuming.
Is there a streamlined way? Because even this show, like, we're just recording the very first episodes right now. We haven't even figured out our editing process yet. I'm starting to think about, like, I wonder if even newer tools like Descript, can we pop these files in there and even streamline the editing process? Is that possible yet?
Yes. Yeah. So that's the tool that I was going to lead with. So Descript is one that I use a lot. I use it on Matt Report and we use it for audiograms for 3 clips and the audience podcast that I record. But number one, Casels Productions. If you're looking to outsource all this stuff, you say, hey, I got some cash and I just want to outsource it to somebody. You knock on our door. It starts at $75 per episode for basic editing. And if you just want to offload it, Casels Productions, great way to go.
And by the way, Castos does all the editing for my other show, Bootstrapped Web, and they have since day one. So it's been awesome.
Yep.
Yeah.
But for me, for Matt Report, I do use Descript, and look, it's a little bit of, I've been doing it for so long, I know what I have to edit, and I will actually keep, if I'm recording with somebody and I'm interviewing them, I use an app called Simple Note, and I will literally write down anything that I think was just a really bad segment or piece, and I'll just note the time. Like literally, it's as simple as that. Write it down. It doesn't have to be an app. Just say like these moments were kind of rough, and just leave yourself a little mental note. And the beauty with Descript is,
and so so I'm just picturing you on a live recording with someone, and you're talking with them, and you're just noting down like, this is boring. This is boring.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll note things like questions I didn't like. Here's what comes up most: questions I asked I didn't like, and I just like 7-minute mark. That was a dumb, like whatever. That was 7-minute, and I'll just put like a question mark. I just know like that's going to be an area that I look at. Folks who have really long run on answers, and I have really long run on questions sometimes too. I have an idea. This is why like all the prep work is very smart. Like if you're looking to really optimize your time, you have to prep first without, going overboard, I guess. But you have to have an idea of who you're talking to pre-interview. What's that one thing? So that when you get on that call, you know what you're going to ask. If it's super open-ended, then that's where it becomes a real challenge to produce a great show. But then sometimes they say something, you're like, wow, like where was that? Like, let's explore that. And that's what you would need to pay attention to. And with Descript, I already know the mannerisms. Everyone has a mannerism or a tick that they do. And if somebody gives me an amazing answer, I'll usually go, yeah, wow, that's great. And I'll say that like 15 times throughout the show.
Yeah.
And in Descript, I can visually see me front loading a question and just like giving like this wrap up answer to the answer that the guest just gave me. And I like give my little 2 cents because I'm just kind of building rapport with the person. And in Descript, I can just say, yep, delete that.
Cut it all out.
So,
yep.
Yeah, so I just literally scan the whole thing. I remove the filler words that Descript automatically does for you. So that's a huge time saving. And then I just go through and I just chop all the big paragraphs of me talking. And I just drill it down to the question.
And so the cool thing for those who don't know with Descript is you're literally editing text. You're taking the transcript of the audio, and you're not editing it. What a traditional audio editor would do is like editing the waveforms. You're literally going word by word in the transcript, and you can edit it like a text document. So what I'm wondering is it good enough yet to actually edit a podcast that way?
Yeah. So there's some bells and whistles in there. So for example, 2 things one would have to be aware of. Number 1. The filler word thing sounds amazing, and it is amazing. But the challenge is if you just remove all the filler words that they're looking for, then it becomes way too choppy. So if you have too many words that you use, then it almost sounds like too robotic. They've actually improved it considerably from when they first released this stuff. So I only scan for things that I know I say a lot, like I mean, like.
So you can tell.
You can identify which word.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that you can. I thought it just sort of like randomly finds like ums and stuff like that.
Yeah, so you can check off like which word you want it to find, and I just clean up those choice words, and then I do listen through. I listen through at 2x speed as I edit and chop some chunks out, and Descript is great for that. You want to do an intro and an outro, it's good. I do take it a step further because I like to make perfect transitions with like sound, not perfect, but like I feel like I want to do some stuff that's a little bit more accurate. Descript doesn't do multi-track that well yet. So I export it into a program called Hindenburg. This is equates to something like a GarageBand, an Audacity, Adobe Audition. And then I just do the final I do the cold open at the beginning. So I find a great clip from the show, 30 seconds, put it at the front, do my ad for who sponsors the show, music bed. I do a 1-minute monologue into the show, and then the rest of the meat of the show plays.
Super cool.
So I do the final edits in Hindenburg. You could use something like Audacity, but Hindenburg is really easy to use and also powerful. It's a nice balance.
Super cool. So again, like right now, we haven't even started doing any post-production on these first episodes yet. We will start this in March. But I'm actually working with a writer, and she's been writing some fantastic articles and stuff for Zip Message. And the plan is to have her do the editing for this show. And she's not traditionally a podcast editor. I'm wondering, because my thought is we could use a tool like Descript, because it's literally like editing text. And we'll figure out the kinks and kind of dial in the, getting rid of the unwanted words and stuff like that. But I'm wondering if that's where the future of podcast post-production is going. It might be a little unfortunate for the audio editor, the freelance audio editors out there. There's a lot of them, but like with tools like this, like, because it's nice to have the podcast editing task go hand in hand with the writing task that would go along with, whether it's writing the show notes or spinning off a whole article idea based on what was said. If the same person is able to edit the podcast using something like Descript and then also write articles or write social media posts for it, that seems like a pretty efficient way.
Yeah, I mean, a few points on that. So it's going to turn into like a Descript show, but like one of the things that you would find really enjoyable working with somebody who's not a podcast editor primarily is the collaboration features. So just like you can comment on a Google Doc, you can comment and have a conversation inside a Descript doc. So like what I do with some of my team on the 3 Clips podcast, they make the audiograms in Descript. So they'll just comment and say, hey, Matt, what do you think about this clip right here? So all they have to do is select the paragraph of text and tag me and just say, hey, Matt, what do you think about this clip for the audiogram? So like that back and forth is really cool. You can do things with Descript. You can train your voice. And if you said the wrong word, like literally said the wrong word, your editor could type the word in and you would say that word.
Yeah, they're doing
which
they
is
have
bonkers.
like crazy like voice what do they call that? Like you there's this thing where you can like basically you read a script for like 10 minutes and then you can have it say anything as you in the future. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's hours. You have to train it for like a few hours
Okay.
to get it like really, really accurate. But they give you like this whole script that you read. Whatever.
So basically, I'm only going to record 3 episodes of this podcast, and the next 50 are going to be like AI. Right?
Yeah.
No.
Now the challenge is like they have this new feature called Studio Sound. So I already told you about one of the things where like the removing the filler words still isn't perfect. If you say a lot of them, it's no magic bullet. So if you're like every other sentence, you just can't fix it. But they have this thing called Studio Sound, and it is supposed to say, their marketing term is, it doesn't matter what kind of microphone you use, we'll make it sound like you're in a studio. It does not work. It doesn't even work with this microphone, which is in an untreated room, and I'm not using my good mixer, which is at my studio. It does not do, even with this $400 microphone, you can tell it's super computerized. You sound like a robot, and it's just way too much. So, they're trying these things on the fringes, and it sounds all cool, but at the end of the day, good sound before it goes into the computer is still the most important. And the better you are at verbally talking is going to be better for that stuff.
Interesting. It's so cool. I mean, I can't really... I've played around with Descript. And by the way, folks at Descript, I'm going to be sending you the invoice for sponsoring this episode.
No kidding.
But yeah, like I can't wait to get in there and just see like what we can do with it from a process standpoint, but while still getting the quality taken care of.
Yeah.
I did want to touch on, you sort of talked about it a little bit with audiograms and stuff. So, all right, after the actual episode itself is published or like edited and then published, what's usually happening in your experience? Like what's like making the most impact? I mean, we see the audiograms come across Twitter and stuff. So between that and like email newsletters and having the guests share out what, that they were on a show, like what other sort of like post-publishing things are you looking to do?
Yeah. I mean, for the stuff that we do, everything can always get better. And it's everything else you do around the podcast that makes a podcast successful. So again, just the mere fact that you do the podcast doesn't make it a success. you still have to have the chops to at least do the audiograms, the social posting, and the email. And if you can button that up with, a blog post that hopefully gets some, SEO and some inbound keywords, like those are the 4 pillars that your podcasts are going to stand on. For me, look, I'm just super limited in time, right? For like all the side stuff. But for the audience podcast and for 3 clips, it's exactly that. We run 2 audiograms every week for a given episode. We send it out to our newsletter. Everyone gets a blog post, and then sometimes I'll double that with like a little mini video on our YouTube channel. So if it's something that's really cool or like really newsworthy, I'll do a video on it, or vice versa. I'll do a video and turn that into a podcast, which then becomes part of the social and the email and the blog post.
I was going to ask about the video piece too. I'm still thinking through what my plan is for my plan was to just straight export out this video from Riverside and just put that basically as is up on the YouTube channel. I guess it would have to be like before we edit it together for an audio episode, because you're cutting out pieces, right? So you sort of need like the raw footage on the video. But I mean, what's your take on that? Like, should most podcasts release the whole thing as a video, or just go for like the most interesting 5-minute clip, or don't even need it?
Back to Descript, you can also edit video.
Okay.
So there's that. Again, the challenge is you got to just be careful with Descript. The disclaimer is if you use the filler word removal tool, it will then remove all the filler words in the video. So then you start looking like super choppy, on video. So you just have to be wary of that. And you can set up a project in Descript and have like a fresh copy, and you're only going to use that in video, and then the other copy could just be for the audio, and you edit that deeper, whatever. Look, like everything else, it really depends on how much time you want to invest in it. YouTube is phenomenal for a lot of things. Search, number 1, brand building, connection, community, right? Interacting in comments. It's an amazing tool, but you have to, or amazing platform, but you just have to, put the time in it. At the same time, people want to have a different version of your podcast. So, if you're comfortable with that and you're not just, looking at YouTube, like I got to make sure I get subscribers. I have to monetize the channel. Giving somebody that option to watch the podcast from time to time is a perfect opportunity. Why not do it if you can at least export the video? If you want to go crazy and you want to really edit things together, totally up to you if you have the time. Always Sunny in Philadelphia podcast.
I just noticed they were podcasting the first time last week.
They have a podcast, and I bounce in between. Sometimes I'm listening to the audio, sometimes I'm watching it. And your audience might do the same thing. I do the same thing with all sorts of podcasts.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Joe Rogan is the one where I only catch his content on YouTube clips. Basically, I don't listen to the actual show.
Right. Yep.
And I'm actually finding myself lately, like at night, we'll watch Netflix, but then I'm basically spending an hour watching random stuff on YouTube. We don't have cable TV. It's just basically Netflix and then YouTube. And I'm finding a lot of my YouTube watching happens to be like podcast interviews that are publishing to YouTube. So it's like the podcast content space is now bleeding into a whole separate section of my life. It used to be just when I'm driving or when I'm walking the dog or something or doing the dishes, but now it's literally when I'm actually on the couch, I'm actually consuming certain podcasts because they're high quality, big name interviews and stuff, but they happen to be publishing on YouTube, and that's what breaks it into that space of my life.
One of the best purchases I made last year was YouTube Premium.
Oh yeah.
And so you get no ads.
Yeah.
First and foremost, and it's the only way that you can minimize the app and still play the audio. So you'll be watching, and then you just shut your phone, and it's still playing. So now you're crisscrossing between what's known as a traditional podcast. You're just listening to the audio, and then you're like, oh, let me just open up my phone again. Boom, I can start watching the video again, and it's just totally seamless.
Oh man,
so that's the power of. Yeah, I know. I'm actually ready to kill Netflix. Is what I'm ready to do.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, this stuff it it goes deeper, and it's so like widespread, and now it's getting so much more advanced with tools like Descript. We're recording this. I'm just gonna like plug all the different products that we're using here. I mean, I'm recording this using Riverside. There's other tools like Zencaster and Squadcast that make it pretty easy and seamless to hop on and get good recordings, as long as we don't lose them over the internet, which sometimes happens. But
if you use Descript, you can publish right to your Castos account as well.
Oh, there you go. Solid integration there with Castos. And what I love about Castos, while you're here, might as well plug them too. I've been a Castos customer for many years, both for the editing of Bootstrapped Web, but they also host my other podcasts. And I feel like you guys have a lock on the WordPress space, right? Like,
yeah.
That's been like the big connection. Like if your site is in WordPress, which chances are it is, especially if it's a blog with a podcast, like Castos just plugs right in,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, that's fantastic especially you have a team who's working out of WordPress, where you have like an intranet WordPress. We have a lot of corporate clients that use WordPress internally. That's not public available. And still the way that all podcast directories work is the episode link will point right back to your WordPress website. So, I don't know if it has any SEO power, but it certainly is a user experience thing where if they wanted to click on the episode, it goes directly back to, a WordPress site because it's built into your feed. So, it's a fantastic thing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Matt, this is great catching up with you as always. I'm gonna get all your links. Like you have a much longer list of links than I do, by the way. Now it's funny how that works. But we're gonna get all that stuff linked up in the show notes. Of course, you're Matt Medeiros on Twitter, and you're all over the podcast airways. Anywhere else? Anything else people should know what you're working on these days before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, Castos.com. So you can find me as my day job as Director of Podcaster Success, and all of those other links is at craftedbymatt.com if you wanted to see everything I've done ever, except for maybe a handful of jobs that I've had, like Circuit City is not on there, but craftedbymatt.com is a great place to see everything that I do.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.